Hello and welcome to Next Phase, where we examine the intersection of health and technology and talk about the future of our healthcare system. So today I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. George Margelis. Hi, George.
Hey, Simon.
George, we've known each other, it seems like a long time. I won't say exactly how long, but you've had a particularly interesting career and we've crossed over it many times. I understand that you started out in optometry before you ever went into medicine. You and I were of a similar vintage, practicing in Sydney hospitals around the same time. I was over at Cerner when you were working at Macquarie Group in a commercial capacity. And then while I was at Microsoft, you were over at Intel. So you've had a stellar career in health informatics and you've been active in some of those groups. And now you're working in the aged care space and you hold some academic positions. Help me understand a little bit about your bio and the journey that you've had, and then interested to unpack the landscape we find ourselves in.
So it was interesting. So when I first graduated from high school, it was like, what do we do? And I decided to do optometry because I had the right marks for it, and it seemed like an interesting career. And it had a sort of combination of clinical skills and gadgets, because I've always loved my gadgets and loved my technology. And optometry was one of those few professions where you could actually do your day-to-day work playing with new gadgets. And so I graduated as an optometrist, worked in that field for a couple of years. Bought myself a computer as I was going through optometry school and sort of learned how to do a bit of programming. That developed into its own business sideline, which ended up becoming a full-time business. In the meantime, I sort of decided that optometry was great, but it had its limitations. And the reality was medical training gave you so much more scope. So I actually re-enrolled in medicine whilst running a software business back in the mid-'80s. And then realized, well, there's probably trying to juggle too many things at the same time, including marriage and children at the same time. So I thought, well, that was fantastic experience. I mean, the software world in the '80s is very different to what it is now. It was a whole new environment that none of us knew anything about. So we were all learning on the job. There was no training. I mean, literally it was, learned how to turn on a computer, learn how to program it, learn how to do things with it, and go from there. I did that for 10 years. So I ran that software business for 10 years, and that was quite successful. Sold off that software business and said, okay, well, I've got half a medical degree. Maybe I should go back and finish it. So I actually went back and finished my medical degree in the mid '90s, graduated in 2000. And then spent a year in the hospitals, and a bit like you, realized that the public hospital system had its challenges for those who wanted to do things differently back in those days. It was like, you either conformed or you didn't. And having had a pretty rich life experience already at that stage, I decided I don't think I can conform with this. So I jumped out of the hospital system fairly quickly, got involved in private hospital system. Back then, the private hospitals were trying to do things differently, and in Macquarie Health, to their credit, was one of those companies that was looking at adapting to the new technology, and we did some really interesting projects. And as interesting, I mean, I tell you, back in Macquarie days, we actually were working on a personal health record for individuals' use that would cross over the whole domain of care. This is 2001, so that's 15 years before my health record was even a thought bubble in the government's perspective. We had developed some interesting systems around online diagnosis. So nowadays, when I hear about online symptom checkers and artificial intelligence, I sort of go, well, it's not that new. We actually had that. We were doing that in 2002 on processors that now aren't powerful enough to manage our phones, and yet you can make things happen if you have the right idea. Progressed on from there. So like I said, we ended up at Intel, and that was an interesting journey because I never thought I'd be working for a microprocessor company with a medical background. But as you experienced in your days at Microsoft, those companies really were looking at what their role of technology was. So they had evolved their technologies, and now they were very much looking at how do we use these technologies. And Intel was a fantastic company in that it really grabbed that by the scruff of the neck and sort of said, well, let's look at what the real role of technology is within medicine. And now we had an exciting 10 years up until the time when, of course, the financial crisis has come into play, and that sort of makes large companies have to change their focuses. And and ever since then, I must admit, I still fall back on some of those experiences. And yeah, one of the big things we did back in the early days at Intel was looking at home telehealth, which was a revolutionary idea in 2007, and now in 2020 is assumed to be the basics. And I see even now I see companies popping up with ideas that I sort of said, well, been there, done that. Now let's see how we can actually make it the new normal, because it's all part of that journey. So, and last 12 months, I got asked by the Aged Care Technology Council to chair that organisation to help it go to the next stage where technology is part of aged care, but it's not a proper enabler. It's more just a back end system. So the goal with the Technology Council is to really move technology into a full-on enabler for aged care.
So that's fascinating. There's a word you mentioned in there, the new normal, that I want to pick up on, because we find ourselves living in strange times. We have a global pandemic on, and I think that's revealed some gaps in the maturity of our health technology infrastructure and capabilities. I think about how we've moved as businesses and commercial corporations to doing things over video calling, and I think about health and its readiness, and clearly it's shown up some gaps. What have you seen that's surprised you or hasn't surprised you during this phase, this COVID phase?
So I think the one thing that surprised me was that the initial resistance we got from a lot of clinicians around using telehealth all melted away when they realized that it was actually beneficial to them, not just the patient. So the fact that they now can avoid getting infected by an infected patient, all of a sudden, they lifted that veil of resistance they had previously, where they thought it was too much work for them, it was too much hassle, it was too much reliance on technology they weren't familiar with. But all of a sudden, when they realize, well, actually, there's actually a value for me in this, and that I can actually still see patients and bill without having to put myself at risk, I think that opened up their eyes. The one disappointing thing is that telehealth has become a very broad term, which is everything from, we've seen some recent discussions where an SMS replaces a medical consultation, all the way through to a high-end remote monitoring video conferencing facility. So we need to understand what we mean by telehealth, and understand that it's different things for different people at different aspects of their healthcare journey. But the fact that the clinicians have now accepted the fact that it benefits them and it benefits the patients, and we're constantly hearing stories of patients saying, well, hey, this makes my life so much easier, why weren't we doing this before? And even clinicians saying, hey, this makes my life easier, why aren't we doing it before? Now we just need to combine those into something and make sure we're actually still delivering clinical value. And I think that's the big metric at the moment, is what is the clinical value of what we're providing.
Yeah, there's going to be a maturity journey, and we look at some other countries that are further along the path of telehealth and its maturity. Mm-hmm. And here, I guess, it's a bit of a cultural experimentation for practitioners and for patients alike.
Yep. And the other thing, of course, is, and we've had this discussion over many years, the reimbursement model at the moment isn't fine-tuned for telehealth. So, it's going to be a to and fro, working out how we refine the remuneration model to take advantage of what telehealth does, and keeping in mind that, again, the patients in aged care, we're dealing with patients with multiple comorbidities, with social and health issues and economic issues. So bundling it all up into a service that provides more than just managing your blood pressure. This is managing your quality of life in total. I think that's going to be one of the big learnings out of this.
Yeah, that's interesting. So when you think about what the new normal looks like, everyone's intensely interested in what's going to be different as we settle into the baseline, which some people think it's as early as next month around the corner. Others are projecting out further. What do you think some of the lasting changes might be as a result of this?
Look, I think one of the key things that's going to happen is that we're now going to actually make decisions about risk across multiple spectrums. So in the past, we think about risk as doing something that's potentially putting us at risk. But nowadays, going for a walk down the street can potentially put you at risk. So you're actually going to make ever-going risk calculations about everything you do. And if you can get the same value out of a video conference meeting as you would as of a physical meeting, you'll say, well, I'll lessen my risk by doing it on video. You'll make the same sort of decision about, do I go to an event or do I not go to an event based on your particular risk understanding and portfolio. And I think people are going to have to learn that everything we do in life has some risk associated with it. Balancing risk benefits going to be a calculation we all make, whereas in the past we never had to worry about making that calculation, or we didn't have the option to make that calculation. If you needed to get a repeat prescription or you needed to see a GP, then you literally walked to the GP, waited in the waiting room, followed the current process because there was no other way of doing it. Now there's opportunities to do things differently.
So how do you think technology plays into that management of the risk and creating new options?
Well, I think one of the key things is that we're discovering is that the technology has caught up to the concept. So the fact that I no longer need a state-of-the-art device to do a video conference. So 10 years ago, I would have to sit there and make sure I've tweaked the drivers for my video camera and tweaked the audio drivers, and I had the right set of headphones, because there was only 3 headphones that would actually work with that particular combination of technology. The fact that the technology now is even the cheap and nasty stuff at the corner store has more than enough capability for most of the things we want to do. I think that's changed the world. So it's no longer a limiting factor. I mean, literally, I saw last week a $79 tablet that would do everything my $3,000 computer would do 5 years ago. So why wouldn't I spend that $79? And and when I'm not using it for something for healthcare, I can watch YouTube on it and watch movies on it. So it becomes a given. I think that's going to be the big driver. The fact that so much of the stuff has moved into the cloud, so that no one needs to make a major decision about the hardware expense from a server side. So, I no longer need to set up a data center. I no longer need to worry about who's going to be managing the hardware, because between Azure, Amazon, and the various other cloud services out there, that's now taken out of my hands and put in the hands of people who know what they're doing, and they do it all day, every day, so they do it well.
Something that Intel was ahead of the curve on was this concept of the connected medical home, and they put a lot of effort into the Continua Alliance. I know that. That idea was possibly ahead of its time, given the cost of technology and the connectedness and the miniaturization. Do you think that's ready for prime time now?
Look, I think it's ready for prime time, but we have to make sure we don't oversell it, because at the end of the day, the connected medical home has benefits, but it also has costs, and the costs associated with sometimes loss of privacy, loss of confidentiality, and also recognizing that in a world where we have lots of information, not all that information is of equal value. So we need to work out what information we can use and what information we're gathering just for the sake of gathering information, not recognizing that there may be unforeseen consequences of that information being out there in the future. So I think, the connected home, I mean, and again, in the right target market. So elderly patients with chronic disease, who socially isolated, who need ongoing support. The fact that we can do that, with a couple of $100 worth of devices in their home today, versus having to get out of their house and move into a residential aged care facility to get the same level of care. I think those sort of things are going to be real value. But the fact that, knowing that your fridge door opens 3 times a day, for most people probably doesn't have a lot of value. So recognizing what is useful and what is not. And I think that's where that combination of technical and clinical skills are going to come into play. People recognizing that some things are just living and some things are signs of something going wrong, and being able to identify that early is important.
It's interesting. I mean, there's not going to be a wholesale shift of face-to-face going to entirely digital channels, are there? We've just broadened the potential interactions, and now I think the go forward way of seeing your doctor might just as well be connecting via a video call, remote monitoring, or that face-to-face appointment. They're all viable going forward into the future.
And we're going to see an incremental change. I mean, people will. We've started off with 99.9% face-to-face, one-on-one consultations. We've seen a shift in that over the COVID phase because of the restraints placed on social isolation. Some of that's gone. That pendulum's gone a bit too far in some places, and people are now starting to say, "Well, I actually want to see another human being." So it'll be that swing back. But I think incrementally there'll be a 10% of our consults will now start shifting to remote, and that'll grow over time where you will use the remote consultations for the things it does well. And when you need a real social interaction, when you need an intervention which requires face time with a human being, the human beings will have more availability to do that. So that'll change the dynamics.
George, I think that's a message of hope for everyone out there, especially those working in primary care, wondering how their roles and their interactions with patients will continue into the future. I think the requirement for that doctor-patient relationship is just as important, and the role of the clinic is just as important as well. Well, that's it. That's all we've got time for. George, thank you so much for joining us on Next Phase, giving us your sense of how things are changing as you see it and how things might change into the future. It's nice to know that there's a role for doctors and patients to come together, whether it's virtually or face-to-face.
Absolutely. Looking forward to the future going forward. Thanks a lot, Simon.
Thanks, George.
Bye-bye.